You. Yeah, you need to do the Bellringer.
All right.
Hey now.
Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class. You might learn a ton. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interested too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class. And he's super cool. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
All right, Living Environment fans, we are rapidly approaching the end of the school year, and we're doing so much good review for the big Regents test today. I was thinking about reviewing cell membranes, right? Cell membranes are they control what goes into and out of the cell, and they do it in a very physical manner, right? The first thing you need to remember about cell membranes is that they're made up of lipids. Lipids provide the, right? And they're a lipid bilayer. There's phospholipids make up cell membranes. The head of the phospholipids are hydrophilic, but the tails are hydrophobic. Remember, hydrophobic means they don't like water. And like most lipids, that means you can't mix these into water. They tend to form bubbles, right? This is the cell membrane. Right? Now, because the cell membrane is hydrophobic and hydrophilic, right? Things, to pass through the cell membrane, it has to be able to dissolve in lipid, right? And go through. Water cannot dissolve in lipid very well. So water has a harder time passing through the cell membrane than you would think. To help the cell membrane out, it's embedded with proteins that can serve as channels or gates to let things like water move through the cell membrane, let small things move through, even let bigger things move through the cell membrane. To let really big things through the cell membrane, cells have to kind of capture them, right? It's called endocytosis. Capture them with so basically wrap their cell membrane around those particles. And then they have to send digestive enzymes to these particles and break them into small pieces that then they move through the cell membrane, right? And cell membrane, you move through one of two ways, either passive or active, right? Passive or active transport happens one of two ways. The first one is just what we call simple diffusion. You have more particles on one side of the membrane than on the other. Particles will move through the membrane, as long as they're lipid soluble, move through the membrane until there's an equal amount on both sides. And then the net diffusion stops. So that's diffusion, right? It doesn't take any energy. It just naturally wants to do that. It's the way of the world. Particles want to move. Now, if particles are not lipid soluble, they want to move, but they hit the lipid membrane. They can't move. They're stuck unless there's a doorway open for them. We call that facilitated facilitated diffusion, when there's a protein channel that acts like a little door or gateway to let these guys through. So they can move through diffusion, but they can't just go right through the membrane. They have to go through a protein channel or a gate. If you want to go against the grain, that is, if you want to pump things out against the concentration gradient, you have to use ATP energy, and this is called active transport. Again, it requires proteins that'll serve as little channels to push molecules through the membrane, but it takes energy, ATP energy, in order to do this, because you're going against, like in this case, the molecules really want to come this way. To pump them against the grain, you have to use energy. There are other proteins as well that live in the cell membrane, right? We've got the channel proteins and the carrier proteins, but then there are proteins that serve as receptors, right? So they stick on the outside of the cell and they receive things like neurotransmitter or hormones, right? There are enzymatic proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane that run chemical reactions inside the cell, usually, right? And then there are like peripheral proteins that have things like glycolipids. We usually call these antigens. They identify what the cell is and what it does. And so different types of proteins enable the cell to do different jobs. The membrane does different jobs. The membrane is made up of lipid, but it's the proteins that allow the cell membrane to really do specific jobs. If there were no proteins in the cell membrane, all that could happen would be simple diffusion of lipid-soluble materials. Immune system cells rely on these membrane proteins, right? When, like for example, when a new pathogen appears, it has marker proteins on its cell membrane that identify what it is. There are cells called B cells that can look at those cells and then identify what the markers are, and then they learn what the markers are, and they produce what are called antibodies. Antibodies are proteins that stick to the antigens of these cells and do one of two things. They either target them for destruction by a T cell or by a large macrophage cell, one of those big eating cells in the white blood cells in the immune system. Right? So cell membrane proteins. So what do we have today? I reviewed a lot, but right through the cell membrane made of lipid, right? If water could pass through the cell membrane easily, we'd just be puddles on the floor. So you need to have proteins that allow materials to move through that are not lipid soluble. There are also proteins that enable cells to pump against the grain. That's called active transport. And then, of course, there's proteins embedded in the cell membrane that identify the cell. Those are called antigens or markers, right? MHC marker, antigens. There's a lot going on in the cell membrane. So that's today's review, cell membrane.